Okay, in contrast to all of that, Premier Danelle Smith says this legislation puts Ottawa on notice that Albertans will defend their interests. And Premier Danelle Smith joins me now. Premier, thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure.
You say you're open to amendments to the Sovereignty Act legislation. How far are you willing to go in terms of changing this piece of legislation?
Well, I think it's a good piece of legislation. And what it really does is it underscores the way our country was always meant to work. The way our country is meant to work is that we have two sovereign powers, the federal government that has exclusive areas of jurisdiction and the provincial government, which has exclusive areas of jurisdiction. And as long as we're making sure that we respect Aboriginal and treaty rights, both of those levels of government should stay in their own lane. And so what we're doing is trying to get back to the way the country is supposed to operate. We think Alberta should be treated a little bit more like Ottawa treats Quebec. They should be a lot more deferential of our areas of jurisdiction. And if they stay in their areas of jurisdiction, I think we'll be just fine.
But Premier, there are more than two lanes in Canadian federalism, so I'm wondering why Cabinet needs special powers to amend legislation while sidestepping the Alberta legislature in order to send a message to the federal government. I mean, why can't this be done through normal legislative means rather than special Cabinet powers?
Well, the whole purpose of this is to make sure that it gets legislative approval. No motions under this act can proceed without getting the legislature to buy in and to give clear direction to Cabinet about the kind of things that they want them to do. And so that's part of the reason why we want to assert the fact that the legislature is the place to make these decisions. If that's a little unclear in parts, I'm open to making some amendments to make sure that that's clear. But that was always the intention, is that when we decide that we're going to take on Ottawa and we're going to push them back in their lane, I want to make sure that the representatives of Alberta have a chance to weigh in on it.
But you're talking about a resolution that would give broad direction to Cabinet, and then Cabinet would have the authority to amend legislation. With the laws as written now, without coming back to the Alberta legislature for approval on the amendments, Cabinet is not a legislative body. How can you justify giving Cabinet the ability to change laws without coming back to the legislature for approval?
Well, I agree. I mean, what the legislature does all the time is give Cabinet direction to go on and create regulations, to do ministerial orders, to do directives, and to do policy changes. And so that was
not legislation.
Intention.
That's not legislation. Legislation is a higher bar.
It's enactments. And so I think we maybe have a little lack of clarity. We never intended for it to apply to statutes. Statutes do have to come back to the legislature for approval. And if there is any statutory change that would have to make coming out of these motions, we'll make it clear that that is the case. But the intention is to have the legislature give clear direction to Cabinet so that they can move forward on making regulatory and policy changes to make sure that we enforce our rights.
Okay, you talk about everyone staying in their lanes, but it is the lane of the judicial system to decide if something is constitutional or not. And under this act, Albertans are being asked to trust MLAs to decide whether or not something is constitutional. That's the power you're giving yourself in this act. I mean, why should Albertans trust the MLAs to do that when that is the job of the court system in Canada?
Well, I think it's because there's certain areas where it would be very obvious if Ottawa stepped into our turf. And I can give two examples of what I'm watching right now. They've already put on the table a consultation that would bring through a policy change that would have our oil and natural gas sector forced to reduce emissions 42% by 2030. Now, they're calling it an emissions cap. But if you bring forward a piece of legislation that has such a draconian fast timeline and there isn't any reasonable way it can be met, that acts as a production cap. And quite frankly, that's offside with the Constitution. They're not allowed to tell us the pace at which we can develop our resources. That's under Section 92A. It's provincial power. Same thing on fertilizer. They want to have an aggressive emissions target of reducing emissions 30% by 2030. It's the same thing. It's a de facto production cap. And those would be two areas that if the federal government goes forward, I would say it's illegitimate. Those would be the first two uses of the Sovereignty Act.
But hasn't the Supreme Court already ruled on the fact that an emissions cap is within the federal government's regulation through the fight over carbon pricing and the ability to put prices and restrictions on pollution?
We already have prices on industrial emissions in Alberta. And that's one of the ways in which I think our Sovereignty Act and the aggressiveness that we have taken on defending our constitutional territory has already shown some success. The Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, has accepted that our pricing on industrial emissions under our program is in sync with federal aspirations. And that's all we're asking for, is that we believe that Alberta is best able to make the decisions about how to get to carbon neutrality. I know that there is a big appetite for that in our energy sector. They see it as a source of great new investment. The problem is that the federal government has been looking at these kinds of issues as if they want to cap production and keep it in the ground. And that's not going to work in our province. We want to work on carbon tech. We want to work on hydrogen. We want to work on LNG export. And as long as the federal government is willing to work with us on that, I think that we can have a good relationship.
But on issues of constitutionality, Premier, I mean, this is what we rely on judges for. This is why we have lawyers. This is why we have judges. This is why we have courts. So if you think an emission cap on fertilizer and an emission cap on your resources is unconstitutional, then why not seek a reference to the court or take the government to court? Because what expertise, quite frankly, do MLAs have to determine whether something is constitutional or not when that is the realm of the courts in this country?
Well, we are duly elected, and I think it's the job of every elected member to make sure that they're passing legislation that's legitimate. And unfortunately, the federal government has, I think, on consistent occasions, passed legislation that goes outside its constitutional areas of jurisdiction. I mean, if you look at the Constitution, the way it's written, we have exclusive powers to develop our resources and a whole range of social program delivery. And the federal government has its powers. I wouldn't dream of passing legislation that violates federal jurisdiction. I have no interest in getting into national defense or foreign aid or printing currency or running passport offices. I'm just asking for them to have the same respect for our constitutional jurisdiction. And they haven't, quite frankly, in recent years. We've tried a number of ways to try to keep them in their own lane. Nothing's worked. So now we need to try something new.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to pretend that the federal government doesn't do things that sometimes intrude on provincial jurisdiction. We've seen it with health strings, strings on health money, and this is always the tension in federalism. But what you're talking about doing also runs into the lane of the courts. And I just wonder if I can get a clear answer on this, because the briefing notes for your legislation says this is likely constitutional. Who wrote the Sovereignty Act? Was this political staff, or was this your Department of Justice? And who did the constitutionality assessment of this? Because there's a lot of experts in the country who say this law is not going to pass a constitutionality test.
Well, there's a lot of experts who say that it absolutely will pass the constitutionality test. Many of them have gone public. I've put that out on my Twitter if people want to see us quoting those who have said that it will pass the constitutional test. We've got teams of lawyers that have looked at this. We had our department draft the policy, and the intention of it was always to affirm the Constitution and confirm the Charter of Rights and confirm the Aboriginal and treaty rights of our First Nations people. And as long as the federal government is acting in good faith and wants to work with us, I don't think we're going to have any conflict. But that hasn't been the case in the last 7 years. In the last 7 years, every time Alberta has tried to start a new relationship with Ottawa, we've had the door slammed in our face. Even Rachel Notley, our former NDP premier, she brought in a carbon tax, she brought in an emissions cap, she phased out coal. And in return, we got a cancellation of Northern Gateway, cancellation of Energy East, cancellation of Tech Frontier Mine. We didn't get social license. When Jason Kenney tried to talk with Quebec about how we might work together to export LNG, initially they said yes. And then they said no, cancel the Port Saguenay project and started pulling oil and gas leases of our businesses. When we wanted to have an equalization referendum to talk about a new relationship with Ottawa, they gave us Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, who's done nothing but attack our province and our industry for the last year. So we have tried to be constructive. We tried to do things the old way, and now we need to try something new. We need a new relationship.
Look, I'll grant you the federal government did kill Northern Gateway, but they did also buy the TMX pipeline and are expanding it. That happened while Rachel Notley was premier. Keystone XL was killed by the U.S. federal government. Tech Frontier pulled out because they felt there was too much political uncertainty and fighting between Alberta and Ottawa, which this does not necessarily solve. And Energy East ran into a lot of challenges in Quebec and Eastern Canada that go beyond the federal government. So, like, how does the Sovereignty Act get the U.S. president to give the permissions for Keystone? How does it get Quebec to allow something like Energy East to go through some of its territory? I mean, these are issues bigger than your relationship with Ottawa.
You've just made my point. Northern Gateway was affirmed, and then this government canceled it.
Right. Energy
East and the Tech Frontier Mine both pulled the plug because of regulatory uncertainty created by Ottawa. And then, of course, the Saguenay project is the government's job. The government actually does have at the federal level the trade and commerce power. And we gave them that power so that they would be able to help get our products to market, not so that they would block them. And they haven't defended us in any regard. They haven't defended us when Quebec has made decisions that have impacted our ability to get our product to other parts of the country. And they didn't defend us when the federal government canceled Keystone XL. So these are the things that we see in our province, is that all of the uncertainty that is being created, all of the dollars that have fled from investment have been because of federal government decisions. We need to create an environment where Ottawa stays in its own lane so that we can develop some certainty in our province so we can start attracting those investment dollars back.
But you said the other day you hope you never have to use this act, but you've also already, in this interview, identified two areas on natural resource emissions and fertilizer emissions. I've read in some of the reporting from my colleagues in Alberta that you've asked your ministers to scour federal decisions and federal legislation to look for other issues that could be challenged under this act, with the idea of bringing a resolution to your legislature by the spring. That doesn't sound like you're hoping not to use it. That sounds like you're gearing up to use it and have this fight with the federal government.
You know, and I'm pleased to hear that Prime Minister Trudeau is not interested in a fight. In my first conversation with him, I said that we share his aspiration to get carbon neutral by 2050. Our businesses here are interested in doing that, but we have to do it in a way that makes sense for our economy. And one of the signs that I think we're having a breakthrough is at COP27, when Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault refused to sign the final communique, saying he understands that natural resources are provincial jurisdiction. If he signed a resolution talking about phasing out oil and natural gas, he would face a legal challenge from the provinces that he probably would not win. This is new language from the federal government. And I must tell you, I think the only reason they are talking this way is because we've begun pushing back and saying that we are going to assert our rights under the Constitution. And if they stay in their own lane, if they work collaboratively with us, then we won't ever need to use it. I'm looking forward to seeing if we can reset the relationship. That's all Albertans have ever wanted. We're proud Canadians, but unfortunately, we have a federal government that has been targeting us with unfair legislation and destroying our economic environment here for the last 7 years. And that's what's got to stop. That's the reason for this legislation.
You keep using the phrase stay in their own lane, but yet here you are getting into questions of constitutionality where you're going to decide what's constitutional or not, and that is explicitly the lane of the courts. You've given yourself permission to direct municipal governments and municipal police forces to ignore federal regulations when they are duly elected members of, say, City Council in Edmonton or in Calgary and should be able to make their own choices. Police forces should be able to enforce the criminal code as they see fit. I mean, you're bumping into a lot of other people's lanes potentially with the powers you would grant yourself under this law.
Not really. I mean, the whole reason we have a constitution is so that everybody understands what their obligations are and what their areas of jurisdiction are. And the first line is to make sure that politicians are behaving responsibly. And I would say that our constitution only grants powers to a federal entity in its areas of exclusive jurisdiction and provincial. The municipalities get their power from provincial governments. And what we don't want to see, and we've seen this over the last number of years, is the federal government trying to do a workaround on provincial jurisdiction by going directly to municipal levels of government. We don't want to see that happen anymore. We had to already pass legislation that would prevent them from doing that when they were trying to grant specific powers to municipalities to impose handgun bans. And so these are the kind of things that I think you will find that Alberta wants to make sure that the federal government is not trying to circumvent the duly elected body that we have in the provinces. The provinces have the power to develop our resources. We've got the power to manage our social programs in our own way, establish our relationship with our school boards and our municipalities. And I think Ottawa, unfortunately, continues to overtax our province and then use its federal spending power to try to manipulate our decisions. And we're just not going to do that anymore. We can have a constructive relationship with Ottawa, but I think it begins with them respecting our jurisdiction the same way that they do with Quebec. There's some of the things that they do to Alberta that they wouldn't even dream of doing to Quebec. And that's all we want, is let's just establish some pretty clear lines so that we can have a constructive relationship.
You mentioned guns. As you know, the federal government is looking at expanding its restrictions on weapons, and there is an argument happening right now in Parliament about whether that covers hunting rifles or not. I know you don't support the gun policies of the Trudeau government. If they pass, is this the sort of thing you would use the harm test or the constitutionality test in your legislation to stop? And would you compel police forces not to enforce it?
Well, not just us, but so same with Saskatchewan, same with Manitoba, same with Yukon, same with New Brunswick. All of us have taken a stand saying that the federal government is going outside its reach. When you look at the Constitution, property and civil rights belong to the provinces. Policing belongs to the provinces. Our RCMP contract, we set the priorities for it. And we've made it very clear to them that we are not going to enforce their confiscation, that our policing priorities center around stopping firearms from coming across the border illegally and being used in gang and other violent crime in Calgary and Edmonton and other major centers. That's where we want to put our policing resources.
But unless compelled, municipal police forces could choose to enforce this. Would you compel the Calgary police, the Edmonton police, not to enforce this? Are you prepared to tell police officers not to do that?
I'd be shocked if Calgary and Edmonton police want to make this their priority. We have got a major mental health and addiction crisis in our two major centers.
But there wasn't a question,
we
Premier.
have a huge.
It's about how far you're prepared to direct the police. Is my question.
As I've said, we will not use our policing resources in our province on the federal gun confiscation program.
But a municipal police force is municipally funded, federally regulated, or provincially regulated, excuse me, under a provincial act. I mean, are you going to tell the chief of police in Calgary they can't confiscate guns if they want to do it?
As the directive says, municipalities get their power from the provincial government. We're not going to allow the federal government to be directing those levels of government. These are the kind of things that we will not allow the federal government to step in our lane on. So, well, correct.
And what if these provincial organizations don't listen to you? What if they defy your directive and choose that they want to do business with the federal government and choose that they want to enforce gun regulations and want to do these things in defiance of your legislation? What's your penalty, or what is your recourse should they not listen to you because they don't think you're staying in your lane?
But exactly will go to the legislature. That's exactly what the Sovereignty Act is all about, is that if we identify an area where we think that Ottawa is overstepping, then we will put forward a motion and we will get the legislature to approve a number of different steps. I wouldn't want to prejudge that because those are decisions of elected members.
All right, a final question. The Calgary Chamber of Commerce and others have said that this is going to create a lot of uncertainty. It's going to drive business away, and that in attempting to stand up for your province and strengthen your economy, they and others say that the uncertainty this creates and the measures that you're taking in this legislation is going to undermine confidence of investors to come to do business in Alberta. What's your response to that?
I've been fielding calls and having meetings all day with people who are very unhappy with the decisions and the words of the chamber president. She didn't do any consultation before she made that statement. I can tell you, not everybody agrees with her. There's a lot of people who understand that the reason why we have the difficulties in Alberta right now, the amount of investment dollars that have been chased away, have been almost entirely because of federal government decision and federal government confusion in the and interference in the regulatory process. What I am hearing from the business leaders who've contacted me is that they're grateful that we are doing something to push back against Ottawa so that we can create an environment that'll get us back into attracting international investment again. And that's the whole purpose behind it, is that we want to create some certainty that the way the federal government has been conducting itself towards Alberta in the last 7 years is unacceptable. And we're not going to put up with it any longer. And so if we can start a new, more productive relationship with Ottawa, then that's what I hope the outcome will be. That's the intention. No
business owners have called you expressing concern. They're worried about this. They're worried about the consequences of this. All your phone calls 100% on board?
The people I've talked to today, they wanted to make a special point of telling me that they did not agree with the comments of the chamber president. And so I'm pleased that the business community understands what it is we're trying to do here, and they know that I'm trying to defend them. That's I think the problem that we've had in the last number of years is we've got a hostile federal government who've created a very difficult business environment for us, and they want us to fight back.
Do you anticipate this whole thing ends up in court? It feels like there are a lot of people lining up to challenge the very legal foundation and the constitutionality of this legislation.
No, I don't think that the legislation will end up in court. I mean, we've had other legislation in the past. For instance, the legislation brought through by the NDP to turn off the taps, that was challenged as being unconstitutional, and it was found to be valid. So I would anticipate that if the only time that we might end up with some kind of constitutional discussion is if a motion comes forward. So the ball is really in Ottawa's court. What we're telling them is just stop passing unconstitutional legislation, stop interfering in our jurisdiction. And if they stop doing that, there wouldn't be any reason to bring a motion forward.
All right, Danelle Smith, you've been generous with your time. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You bet, my pleasure.
That's Alberta Premier Danelle Smith.